All right, welcome to this course. This is Judaism, Jewish Community, and Race, a course from Pluralistic Rabbinical Seminary. This masterclass is made possible by our friendship with TribeHerald Media, and we certainly thank TribeHerald a lot for that. So our guest that we have today is Eli Forman, and I wanted to, first of all, thank you, Eli, for coming and being a part of this. I wanted to read something that you had written. This is, I think, from your first post on Tribe Herald. So here we go. There isn't a single native Jewish ethnicity or experience. Not of all of us are Ashkenazi. Some of us are like me, but some are Sephardic, Maghrebi, or Italkim, and some are converts or weren't raised Jewish, but still have the ancestral connection. I wasn't raised Jewish, but I have the roots. But we remain invisible, and that might be the most hurtful thing. It seems often that no one cares about who we are, about our experiences and hardships, or they ask how in the world we could exist, same way that everyone else does. And we Jews and we natives have that kind of deep connection. Our histories of persecution as a method for strong empathy to form. Maybe that is why at least 1 to 2% of my local Jewish population is Native American. We can understand one another all too well. So tell me a little bit about that piece and kind of what you were thinking about when you wrote it.
Well, first of all, I was just trying to get people to realize that Native American Jews do exist. It's not even just me. There's plenty of others. I know many others. I mean, in that same piece, I actually open up with mentions of people who are Native American and Jewish, including an astronaut, including a friend of mine who is a writer, including a musician. If you are familiar with the Oyster Cult, Andy Panda, one of the guys who started it up, although don't say that nickname to him. Andrew Winters does not like that nickname. He's half Guatemalan Mayan, half Ashkenazi Jewish. But there's plenty of others like me, but we're all different. There's so many different tribes and so many different Jewish ethnicities that the intermingling is never quite the same between any two people.
You mentioned this idea of it almost being hard for people to comprehend that such a person as a native Jew could exist, and I'm wondering kind of what you think about that. What runs through your mind when you consider that this may be something people haven't thought of before?
Well, first of all, a lot of people think Native Americans aren't still around. That I have run into many a time, both growing up and still today. People think we're gone. So the idea of a Native American who's also Jewish is completely out there because most people think of Jews as just white. They don't think that the two things are able to interconnect at all. They think they have one stereotypical image of one and one stereotypical image of the other, and don't realize that the two can be merged into one person or a multitude of people. And I know people of all, I mean, they're not just Native and Jewish. I know someone who's Black, Native and Jewish, someone who's Black, Asian, Native and Jewish, and there's many different experiences. We don't have one single experience. It's like, I think in one piece that I wrote, I described it as we're a mixed multitude within the mixed multitude.
I'm interested in this idea of how, when we're thinking about race, we're also thinking about class, and something that we know to be true, and you've written a little bit about this when it came to Native health, was the fact that Native populations tend to be disproportionately lower income. And I wonder if part of the sort of inability for some people to consider that a Native Jewish person could exist on this planet somehow has to do not just with perhaps racial overtones, since we know, some white Jews do think of Jewish identity racially, but if it has to do with class, of how could a perhaps stereotypical upper class Jew ever connect with a person who does not sort of fit into that category? Do you think there might be anything to that?
Well, that's where we get into some of the more complex parts of Native history. For the most part, most Native Americans are lower income, but that's not entirely the case, especially in the case of those who graded heavily into the upper class whites. The part of my family, the Red Bowlings, who descend from Pocahontas, come immediately to mind, descendants of Jane Rolfe, who but these people have totally assimilated into whiteness. They think, oh, it's just this part of someone's distant ancestry. They don't realize someone could have Native as a major part of their identity. But at the same time, they've most of the time, most people don't even run into Native Americans, especially in Jewish communities. So the idea of someone who's Native and Jewish is almost completely foreign to so many people, because for a lot of us, when we enter any other space, we're thought of only as one part of our ancestry, whether it's white or black or Asian or what have you. They don't think about the Native part. So it's kind of like, for those of us who are Native and Jewish, when we walk into a synagogue, we're thought of as Jewish, but they don't think about the Native part. It's kind of like the inverse of the situation of a black Jew. Like, when they walk into a synagogue, their blackness is thought of first, and that their Jewishness is almost invisible a lot of the time. Imagine how hard it is for black Native Jews.
So tell me a little bit about that inversion there. And so it sounds like what you're saying is that for Native Jews, walking into a synagogue environment, as an example, is going to be a completely different experience than for a black Jew, as you mentioned.
Well, sort of. Considering there is a whole lot of overlap between African American Jews and Native American Jews. A whole lot of African Americans have Native American ancestry, so the overlap is significant. I mean, it's not even like it's a small amount. I mean, large portion of the black Jewish community, black Jews around here, making up at least 10% of the local Jewish population where I live, are of Native American descent.
Interesting.
But at the same time, you see so many people who, because I can't speak for the entire situation, I mean, for the entire experience of black Jews, but I've seen from both people I've talked to and from things I've witnessed, where people think immediately black Jews are converts. But a lot of Native Americans, the Native is 1/8, 1/16, but it's still a major part of their experience. Now, this is in the United States. Canada, where First Nations make up a much larger percentage, it's going to be different. Oklahoma, it's going to be different. It depends on the area you are in a lot of the time, because I've seen some people who look more Native, they're not going to be thought of as necessarily as white. Whereas my is, I am whatever people want to be racist against. I have been called, I don't know how many different epithets, both for Hispanics, for Asians, for Arabs. It's ridiculous.
Okay, it's incredible to consider. Talking about this idea of region, just a little bit about me. I used to live in Washington State, and when I lived in Washington State, the Spokane tribe and the Coeur d'Alene tribes used to have big events, things like that. But as we were talking earlier, I'm from Georgia, where the Native sort of community looks very different, and it seems like in the Southeast, because of the obvious history of Native peoples from the Southeast, and especially here in Virginia, it is hard for a Native person to have that type of sort of cultural connection. Do you find that to be the case, since we're both people who live in the South? You more so than I do.
That's been a large portion of my life, actually. I didn't grow up within the tribe. It was always part of my heritage, but I never was raised that way. I've had to do a whole bunch, but it was always part of my identity. Because I've always known. It was never something hidden. We didn't know exactly where it was from, and from how many sources we had absolutely no idea. But we didn't hide it, but we never were raised in it. Now, it wasn't necessarily from deliberately hiding it, but it was because of how the Shawnee were forced to move, how the Cherokee were forced to move, how numerous tribes were forced to move. It's a lot harder for someone who was not able to be a part of those roles. From some of the more outlying groups, it's a lot harder for you to have this kind of connection, especially when you factor in things like blood quantum and all the other stuff that have, and then disenrollment, and then you have tribe termination, which happened to the Lumbee and other tribes. So you have all these different things that the government did to deliberately break us apart. So the identity is very fragmented here in the South. It's Southeast. Southwest is going to be a whole different story, especially but I can't really speak to it. I'm not from there, but I do know people from there. But the native experience very much depends on where you are. Oklahoma, it's going to be very strong. Arizona, New Mexico, where a large number of tribes are, it's going to be very different. The Northeast, it's going to be a totally different, and the cultures are all completely different. The religions and everything else are also completely different. The languages aren't even related, which for me, being of Cherokee descent, that's a complete outlier, because the only neighbors who spoke a similar language were the Tuscarora, and it was an entirely different branch. The only neighbors of the Cherokee who spoke an Iroquoian language were the Tuscarora. So we were the outlier even before them.
Yeah. I'm wondering, in terms of your own personal history, since you grew up with a knowledge of Native ancestry, and because you have Jewish roots as well, was there a time in your life where it went from sort of, I know I have this in my background, to this is more who I am? Anything like that?
Well, I didn't know about the Jewish ancestry until about 2015, when I was actually doing some research on my family tree. Well, not necessarily on a little bit on the family tree, but also on where my family name came from, which one I discovered straight up the male line. One of my ancestors was Jewish, and that was the first one I found. Then I didn't really touch it as much for a few years, came back last year and discovered a whole bunch more. The native I had searched for, didn't necessarily find it at first, then realized there were a whole bunch of apps for me to search my ancestry, and I hit upon truckload after truckload of information regarding my family tree. It was very interesting that part was where I could find some more prominent ancestors, like the Bowlings. I belong to the white Bowlings, not the red Bowlings, but I found other ancestors from the Powhatan tribe, from the Pamunkey, the Potawatomi, the Cherokee, from at least one or two different sources, Shawnee, Mohawk, and by way of Mohawk, Mohegan, Narragansett, Pequot, Wangunk, and Montauk. And then from the Shawnee, well, I thought the ancestor from that was, she had married a French Canadian. Well, he was French Canadian, but he was Métis by way of Cree. Well, Métis. So it was. I keep finding more. I'm still discovering more of who I am.
Has this changed how you lived your life or how you think about yourself?
To some extent, I mean, finding out all these different things, it really does. You can't learn that you descend from a whole bunch of native tribes. I thought my dad's side was mostly white. I was wrong. I was very wrong. There were, I mean, the grandparent I thought had no Jewish ancestry whatsoever was the first one to find a direct Jewish ancestor of, and that was my grandmother, Ambrosio Lepo. That was his name. And it was interesting because I didn't find this out until about 3 years after she passed away. And I was very close with her. So the fact that, you know, she's still providing these gifts to me even long after she's gone it's very sweet.
It's wonderful. Do you know at all why sort of the Jewish side or the Jewish history was sort of not talked about the way that the native part was, even though it seems like it was a bit tangential?
Well, it wasn't entirely tangential because, I mean, though the beard may obscure it, it was always visible in my face for the native. The Jewish part was more of, well, it's the South. Also, the fact that one of the ancestors immigrated to England at a time when Jews weren't necessarily allowed to openly profess Judaism in England.
Mm-hmm.
Ambrose Poe was there before Cromwell invited the Jews back.
Gotcha.
But the one straight up the mail line, I have no idea. And the other sources, well, I also have no idea. I don't know as much about them as I do about Ambrose Lepo. And the only reason I know him as much as I do about Ambrose Lepo was because he was famous.
Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about him.
It would be a completely different story.
Yeah, well, tell us a little bit about him.
Ambrose Lepo was, his mother was a Talkim. His father was the son of a Maghrebi Jewish man from Algeria, from Morocco, and a Sephardic woman. His dad was born in 1490 in Spain. Bad year. Well, good year. 2 years later, bad year.
True enough.
Then, so his family had to move to Italy, and his son, Ambrose, was born there. He became a very famous viol da gamba player and viol player, and wrote several viol quartets. Then he was invited by the court of King Henry VIII, who may or may not be my ancestor through other lines, but that's another story entirely. He was invited by King Henry VIII to be a court musician alongside 3 other people. These 3 other people were Jewish. If you've ever heard the name Taliaferro, that's where it comes from, most likely. From another one of the musicians. There were a few others, but I think Barasio or a few. They were all Jewish, for the most part. They're all fairly well known. If you ever wish to look them up, look up the Jewish court musicians of Queen Elizabeth or King Henry VIII. He served the longest of all of them. 40 years, had his own coat of arms.
Wow.
2 sons. One of the sons moved to the Americas, and I descend from the daughter of that grandson.
Interesting. Wow. So I'm curious to know, you had mentioned kind of 2015 as being a pivotal point for learning a lot of this. And then, now we're in 2020, and I'm just wondering, over the past 5 or so years, has the way that you've lived your life changed? Are you oriented in a different way as a result of knowing the sort of complex and interesting history and identities that you have?
Yes. Hold on. Yeah. Well, first of all, I think part of that was the election. The election definitely changed my head a little bit on that one. Then, of course, 2017 was the first time I ever visited a synagogue, and then it took me another year to show back up. Well, no, actually, I showed up at another synagogue for the Hanukkah party, and then starting in April that year, April of 2018, I started attending a synagogue more often, and then I started trying to at least weekly, if not more, and luckily there are 3 synagogues in my hometown, which small Jewish population, 3 synagogues, go figure. One conservative, one Reform, and one Chabad.
Of course. Where there's Coca-Cola, there's Chabad.
Yep. But I tried to attend every Jewish event I could, still do. It's not as easy when there are no public Jewish events. But I got very, very involved in the community. Last year, I went kosher. I've only gotten more I don't know how I managed to maintain kosher throughout the entirety of the pandemic, but I've done it. I don't know why I've done it, but I've done it. Maybe it's because I've done it for several months now. Why change it now? But it's also I've managed to lose weight despite not being as active.
Interesting. So it was this kind of gradual process, it seems, of incorporating Jewish participation into your life more and more over time. Has that been the case also with your native identity, or does that manifest a little differently because of where you live?
I don't get to be as involved a lot, but I have been involved. I've always known other people who were of native descent. That's not been the issue. I've always managed to run into others who are like me in some way. A lot of whom are from my tribe. Go figure. Even without the people who are questionably Cherokee, the Cherokee are still the largest tribe in the United States.
Interesting.
But they're being, but I've always been mixed. And I've always had to deal with people thinking, oh, you can't possibly be native. You look whitish. And I'm just thinking, I end up looking at them and just really infuriated because denial of someone's identity is denial of that someone is something that they know they are is not. You can tell I'm lacking words.
Gotcha. Okay. So I wanted to ask you about an ancestor of yours. So you have a lot of famous ancestors. Obviously, you mentioned Martha Washington is another one, but there was one.
She's 14 different ways cousin of mine.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about this one in particular, though, Gilbert Cox, who I think is interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about Gilbert?
He's kind of a mix. Oh, you're talking about the one who was a non-white slave owner?
Yes.
Yeah, from what I can tell, he was. There's not a whole lot on him, but from what I can tell, he was at least probably Romani, but also Turkish Jewish from one of his ancestors, as far as I could find. He may have been partially black. But reading through the manifest, not the manifest, his will, you can see the slaves he willed. Some were mixed, some were fully black, and reading that someone was willing this ancestor of yours was willing other human beings to to his children and wife and nieces and nephew was when he was not white himself, it was distinctly uncomfortable. I still don't know his full identity. I know the Jewish ancestry by way of Turkey, but that's all I really know about him. He's kind of, for the most, there's not a lot on him. His parents are known, but the ancestry is kind of a mystery, because when you go through a lot of these, you see a lot of white-looking names, but if you can trace them back to England, but not very much further, they might actually be Indian or some other ethnicity, because it does not give you ethnicity, it just gives you nationality with tracing your ancestry. You have to dig deeper if you want to find ethnicity.
Interesting. I hadn't considered that possibility of nationality research versus ethnic research, and how that would be sort of difficult when you're trying to parse apart things, especially with Jewish identity, because if you are nationally one thing but sort of ethnoculturally something else, I would suspect that maybe that would get lost to time in some cases.
Yeah, you look at, what's an incredibly common Sephardic last name? Ashkenazi.
Right.
You never see it as an Ashkenazi last name.
Right.
It's a Sephardic last name, but the person has an Ashkenazi ancestor somewhere up the male line.
Yeah, that is one that has that is one that has sort of always been fun to me. The fact that you have all these Sephardi Jews named Ashkenazi.
They're part Ashkenazi, but it's way back in the Sephardic by this point.
True. Fair enough. So, where do you feel one draws the line in terms of identity? And here's what I mean by that. Obviously, we've heard this sort of mocking of Elizabeth Warren, the Pocahontas slander type of thing. I'm just speaking as someone who grew up in the South, and you mentioned, being Cherokee, and how I remember growing up as a kid, everyone thought they were part Cherokee, when they're like 6 or 7 years old, if they're from the South and have a family that goes back at least 150 years or so. So I'm wondering, how do you draw the line in terms of, what does it mean to be Native? What does it mean to be Jewish? And at what point are these identities in any way inappropriate to be using, or if there ever is a time when it is inappropriate to state your identity on your own?
Well, that's where things get interesting. Are you familiar with the Cherokee Freedmen controversy?
A little bit from high school, but I don't really know. Please explain.
Okay, the Cherokee Freedmen were the descendants of slaves who were owned by the Cherokee. They are one of many different groups of African Americans who descend from those people who, some have Native ancestry, some don't, but they grew up in that culture, or they were descended from people who grew up in that culture. And by the tribal law and treaty, they're supposed to be considered part of the tribe. The Black Seminoles are another good example, except they weren't slaves of the natives. They just intermarried with them a lot, or lived alongside them. They were Maroons. You see a lot of this, especially in cases like this. Even if they don't have the ancestry, they have for a long enough time been considered a part of the tribe that it is totally appropriate for them to consider that part of their heritage, whether it shows up in a DNA or not. And for some people, the Native ancestry, you descend from people who are assimilated, oftentimes forcefully. And, well, is it wrong to consider yourself part of that as a way of decolonizing from who it is? Not necessarily. Let's face it. There's a lot of people, upper class, who descend from Pocahontas because of the Bowlings. I'm bringing this back in because that's a big family. Now, not all Bowlings. Only like two bowling children descended from Pocahontas because that was from his first wife. Robert Bowling married Jane Rolfe, Pocahontas' granddaughter, her only granddaughter, as far as I know. Though I may be wrong, don't quote me on that one entirely. But the other Bowlings, the ones I descend from, like Mary Malling, one of the daughters, come from his second marriage. His first one was one son, one daughter. The other ones were more kids from Ann Stith. So you see a lot of that. One of the more famous Red Bowlings is Edith Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's wife, which is where things get really messy, considering how the Bowlings, like many of the other first families of Virginia, were involved in slave trade, with plantations. You see all this. And these people have Native ancestry. They know they have Native ancestry. They have famous Native ancestry. But it's also very complicated. It's such a messy subject. I despise the concept of a blood quantum because you end up with people like me where Native is a large portion of your family tree, but don't get to be part of any one tribe necessarily because of how far back it was or how it was not maintained properly, or through membership in tribes was not maintained properly. So, and then you have cases where tribes start to kick people out who don't have enough membership in their tribe, but are almost entirely Native. Yeah, blood quantum is such a messy subject, and because you have people who are totally Native American, don't have enough to belong to any tribe. You can imagine that it can get violent, and it has. It very much has.
In what way?
Let's say things can get messy when it comes to some tribes kicking people out of some more let's say greedy chiefs or elders changing the tribal laws to increase the blood quantum requirement. And then you kick out people who posed for pictures, very famous pictures of members of that tribe. It does get messy. It gets very messy. And there have been people who have been killed over it.
Gotcha. So we're getting to the end of our conversation here, and because of the time of day that we're filming this interview, our rabbinical students, unfortunately, are unavailable to take part in this. But I'm wondering if you have any kind of particular message or any teachings or ideas that, particularly for future Jewish clergy, that you would like to impart on them?
First of all, Native American Jews do exist. There's a good chance you'll run into at least one, just out of the blue. Heck, even they may look Native, they may look white, you may not realize, just because you got to understand the history of Native Jews traces back a long time in this country. And when I say a long time, we're talking early days. Some of the first Jews in Maryland married Native women because there were no European or Jewish women for them to marry. So Native women converted and married into the Jewish community. I don't know how, and we don't know how many Jews in the United States are of Native descent, because this was not the only case. I know it at least happened in Louisiana and at least a few other states. So how far back it goes, don't. Jewish identity and Native identity for these people are not separate, because it's hard for that to be separate when you have a very deep connection to the land, but at the same time a very deep connection to your religion. It really shapes who you are. never forget that that just because they are Jewish and they are in your synagogue does not mean when they walk out the door, they are not still native, or when they walk in the door, they are not still native. And that applies no matter how they look. It doesn't matter if they're black. It doesn't matter if they're white looking, or it doesn't matter if they're Asian. It doesn't matter. They are still native. They are still Jewish. We are not. We're really tired of being invisible. Both as natives and as native Jews.
Gotcha.
Oftentimes it just helps to have someone willing to listen.
Well, hopefully, I've done a good enough start. Not certainly all of the listening, but some kind of start to the listening. And I appreciate, Eli, the opportunity to hear your story and for you to impart this wisdom onto our students. So, with that, we will leave it there. So, Eli Forman, who is writing for TribeHerald, talking a lot about Native Jewish issues. Eli, thank you very much for your time today.
No problem. I'm just glad to do what I can.